Greetings, everyone. I recently managed to isolate all of, or at least the overwhelming majority of the passages in the Clementine Recognitions and Homilies that deal with sacrifice and vegetarianism. So this presentation is a compilation of all the anti-sacrifice and pro-veg passages from the Recognitions and Homilies. So just a very brief introduction to the Clementine literature, if you're not familiar with it. And I'll do more videos in the future going into more detail regarding the recognitions and homilies. But essentially, these are non-canonical texts, obviously. They're Jewish Christian texts and Ebionite texts for the most part, although they do contain a few ideas that we might deem as non-Ebionite ideas, but for the most part, they're Ebionite texts, Jewish Christian texts, okay, and they represent that earliest tradition of Christianity that we also find in the so-called Q saying source, the Gospel of Thomas, the Epistle of James, and the Didache primarily. There are some other Jewish Christian texts also that made their way into the New Testament, but they're not quite as relevant for what I teach in this online ministry. The four most important texts that we use are Q, the Gospel of Thomas, the Epistle of James, and the Didache, but the Clementine Recognitions and Homilies are also extremely valuable and extremely important because they do represent that earliest Christian tradition, what has come to be known as Jewish Christianity, but it's simply what Yeshua actually taught and preached. So it's just Christianity, pre-Paul, before Paul, pre-Pauline Christianity. And so the Clementine literature, although it was written later, it's not first century, like those other four texts I mentioned, it does represent the earliest tradition. And it uses source texts that also likewise represent the earliest tradition, some of which were first century in my opinion, especially the Ascents of James. So some of the sources for the Clementine literature include the Kerygmata Petrou, or the Preaching of Peter, the Travels of Peter, the Book of Elkasai, or the Book of Elkai, and the Ascents of James. Okay, in my opinion, these were the four primary sources used in the composition of the Recognitions and Homilies. So one of the primary sources for the Clementine literature, and by the way, if you search for this stuff online, you'll find it called the pseudo-Clementine literature because scholars do not think that Clement himself actually wrote these books. That's certainly a possibility, but at any rate, we'll just refer to it as the Clementine literature, or just the Recognitions and Homilies. So the first source we'll look at, I'll go through these very quickly, and we'll get to the passages about the anti-sacrifice and pro-veg passages, okay? But the book of Elkasai, or the book of Elkai, was written by the Elkasites, which was a group of Ebionites that were around, I'd say, from about 100 AD to 200 AD, something like that. And so this was their primary text that they used in their community. So it encourages following the law of Moses, the Ten Commandments, more or less, as well as ascetic practices. So they were mystics, for sure. And the universe is held to be governed by principles created by God, who is called the Great and Most High God, the Most High. God's Son Christ is also called the Mighty King in that text, and the Holy Spirit is considered a female entity. So they do respect and honor the divine feminine, the divine mother, which they equate with the Holy Spirit, which is definitely a Jewish Christian idea, Sophia and all that. The Gnostics also revered the divine feminine or divine mother, the feminine aspect of God that we call the Holy Spirit. Christ is held to have lived on earth repeatedly through reincarnation, sometimes arriving through virgin births. And so they had the belief in reincarnation. That is an Ebionite belief, an early Christian belief. I believe that you can even find evidence that that belief was taught by Yeshua in the New Testament and the Gospel of Thomas. And so that's a Christian belief, and it condemns sacrifices and rejects the eating of meat, which is very common Jewish Christian or Ebionite belief. Yeshua, of course, was vegetarian. All his disciples were vegetarians. Says as much in Paul's letters and Acts. I mean, this is not heretical, blasphemous stuff here. It's pretty clear that the original disciples were vegetarians, and of course, they had learned that from Yeshua, who had learned it from the Essenes, or the Nazarenes, or Nazareans. The Ascents of James was another uh, source. The entire text is included in the Clementine literature, and it's very clearly delineated within the text, and so it's pretty easy to define the boundaries of the Ascents of James within the text. And the Ascents of James, I believe, was a first century text. It's quite old and contains a lot of the same ideas you find in the other Jewish Christian texts. Okay. So the document advocated the abolition of the Jewish sacrifices, esteemed James, brother of Jesus, as the leader of the Jerusalem church, and denigrated Paul as a Gentile and opponent of Jewish law. Distinguishing features of the text include an advocacy for the observance of Mosaic law and the elimination of the Jewish sacrifices. Paul is portrayed as a certain hostile person who prevents James from converting the Jewish people to Christianity. Jesus is depicted as the anticipated prophet like Moses, who was sent by God to complete the work of Moses by abolishing the sacrifices in order to redeem Israel. By the way, if you want to learn more about Christian vegetarianism, first and foremost, you ought to watch the documentary Christspiracy that was made by my friend Cameron Waters. Highly recommend checking that out. You can also watch my video on this channel called The Truth About Yeshua, Jesus Was a Vegetarian. Okay? The Kerygmata Petro, or the preaching of Peter, is used as a source, and it's thought to consist of a letter from Peter to James, lectures and debates of Peter and James's testimony about the letter's recipients. Some believe that the original was lost due to the substantially greater popularity of its recensions in the homilies and recognitions. So, the Clementine literature is two texts, the recognitions and the homilies. Okay, the homilies consists of the Epistle of Peter, the Adjuration, also called Contestation, and finally the Epistle of Clement, all followed by 20 numbered books. The books are each called a homily, but more accurately, they are theological, philosophical dialogues. The recognitions, for which the original Greek has been lost but exists in a Latin translation produced by Rufinus. Rufinus, by the way, was well known for redacting the text that he translated, changing things, altering things to fit his particular theology and everything. So it's difficult to say whether what we have today is what was originally written. There is a Syriac translation as well. The original copy was found from around 400 AD, the original manuscript in Syriac, and I have the English translation. There are some differences between the Syriac and the Latin. So the recognitions and homilies was probably written in the 2nd century, but some of the source texts that it employed were likely 1st century Jewish Christian texts, like the Ascents of James that I've already described. So for folks that might not be familiar with this channel and what I teach, and they might say, "Oh, this guy's just teaching non-canonical texts outside the Bible. Jesus never said anything about sacrifice." Well, actually, he did. And so in Matthew 9:13, he said, "Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice." Matthew 12:7, "But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent," talking about the animals that were being sacrificed. So he's quoting there from Hosea 6:6, "For I desire mercy, not sacrifice, the knowledge of God, rather than burnt offerings." Okay? And so, of course, Yeshua was arrested and tried and crucified because he freed the animals from the temple and overturned the table of the people that were charging money to sacrifice animals. So that's because he thought it was morally reprehensible. Okay. We'll start with the recognitions, and I've just pulled these verses straight out of the recognitions and homilies. Anyone can double check my work here. So here we see, uh, and they should learn by means of the prophet that God desires mercy and not sacrifice. And in order to impress this upon them, even before the coming of the true prophet, in the recognitions and homilies, Yeshua is referred to as the true prophet, and the Messiah also, but more often than not, the true prophet is his title. They did not deify Yeshua. Jewish Christianity does not say that Jesus is God, like the Trinitarian theology of mainstream Christian religion, Paulinity, and all of that. Although Paul, it's hard to say he was a Trinitarian, but that was added later, of course, and by the Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church, and all that. But originally, Yeshua was not equated with God himself, and Yeshua says as much, by the way, in the New Testament. That's neither here nor there, but in the Clementine literature, he is called the true prophet. Okay, even before the coming of the true prophet, who was to reject at once the sacrifices and the place. You see, Judaism was never supposed to practice animal sacrifice. That was a pagan, demonic practice that they were practicing in the temple. They were getting rich off of charging folks to sacrifice animals for them for the remission of sins. But that's certainly never what God intended. And, about half the prophets in the Old Testament were railing against the practice of sacrifice because it was never commissioned or required by God. And so that was a corruption of the hearts of men. The priestly caste and the Jerusalem temple that started that barbaric practice for the most part, or at least employed it, used it, and adopted it from pagan and demonic traditions. Okay, but it was never supposed to be that way, and in fact, seems like the original Judaism was vegetarian. Okay, and they never wanted to, never thought God had commissioned the practice of sacrifice. So here we see that he should warn them by the mercy of God to cease from sacrificing, lest haply they might suppose that on the cessation of sacrifice there was no remission of sins for them. He instituted baptism by water amongst them, in which they might be absolved from all their sins on the invocation of his name, and for the future, following a perfect life, might abide in immortality, being purified not by the blood of beasts, but by the purification of the wisdom of God. So the Essenes had instituted the practice of ritual baptismal purification in the living waters for the remission of sins. John the Baptist also practiced that and taught that, Yeshua and his disciples, and the Ebionites as well. And so baptism in the living waters had already replaced animal sacrifice by the time Yeshua came around. And so he was never a sacrifice. That whole idea was invented by Paul and others, and that's not what he taught, and that's not why he came, to be sacrificed for the remission of sins. Baptism had in living waters had already replaced animal sacrifice at that time, had done so for a couple hundred years up to that point, and of course it's an ancient practice, baptism, but not necessarily for the remission of sins. You see, so the Essenes were doing it for the remission of sins. John the Baptist, Yeshua, his disciples, the Ebionites, all practiced ritual baptismal purification in the living waters for the remission of sins as an atonement. And so there was no need for Jesus to be a sacrifice or anything like that. And that was certainly not his purpose here on the planet. Also, you can see here, subsequently, also an evident proof of this great mystery is supplied in the fact that everyone who, believing in this prophet who had been foretold by Moses, is baptized in his name, shall be kept unhurt from the destruction of war, which impedes over the unbelieving nations, etc. So it's pretty clear that baptism is for the remission of sins. You should do it as frequently as you would like. And you can watch some of my other videos about Essene baptism to learn how to pray once you're immersed in the water and ask for the purification. Here it says, "For we," said I, "have ascertained beyond doubt that God is much rather displeased with the sacrifices which you offer, the time of sacrifices having now passed away." Okay? Here, um, "and has adored those whom the pagans call gods, or has eaten of the things sacrificed to them, is not without an unclean spirit, for he has become a guest of demons, and has been partaker with that demon of which he has formed the image in his mind, either through fear or love. And by these means he is not free from an unclean spirit, and therefore needs the purification of baptism, that the unclean spirit may go out of him, which has made its abode in the inmost affections of his soul, and what is worse, gives no indication that it lurks within, for fear it should be exposed and expelled." By the way, um, in ancient times, in ancient Palestine, so called, sacrifice was almost synonymous with meat eating, because if you wanted to eat meat, first you had to have it sacrificed by a priest, and uh, then you could eat the meat afterwards that had been sacrificed to God. And so sacrificing animals and meat eating they went hand in hand. So if you were anti-sacrifice, you were inherently vegetarian. A lot of people get real mixed up on this basic fact. So when we talk about being anti-sacrifice, we're also talking about being anti-meat. Okay, because they went hand in hand in ancient times. So some of these verses don't explicitly state that you shouldn't eat meat, but the idea is if you're not sacrificing animals, you're also not eating meat, because they went hand in hand. "And the things which pollute at once the soul and the body are these: to partake of the table of demons," meaning to eat with people that eat meat at the same table, "that is, to taste things sacrificed, or blood, or a carcass which is strangled." In other words, don't eat meat. "But perhaps, although you live with me, and you do not know my manner of life," this is Peter talking, Yeshua's disciple Peter. Okay? "I live on bread alone, with olives, and seldom even with pot herbs, vegetables." Pot herbs means vegetables, basically. "And my dress is what you see, a tunic with a pallium, and having these I require nothing more." This is very Essene. This is very early Christian, very Nazarene, Ebionite, to wear a white linen tunic and to be a vegetarian. So here, obviously, Peter's saying, I'm a vegetarian. And of course, some of Paul's letters and Acts and stuff like that, Paul argued back and forth with the disciples regarding diet and all of that, because they were vegetarians and he was not. And he was trying to appeal to the Gentiles and all of that, which is fine, but he was going against tradition, and he was going against what Yeshua taught. For the Seres, which I made a note here that the Seres were Chinese people or East Asians, because they live chastely, are kept free from them all. For with them it is unlawful to come at a woman after she is conceived, or while she is being purified. No one there eats unclean flesh. No one knows aught of sacrifices. All are judges to themselves according to justice. For this reason they are not chastened with those plagues which we have spoken of. They live to extreme old age and die without sickness. A couple times in the Clementine literature, uh, the author speaks of the Bactrians, for example, which were Indians, more or less, Hindus, or Buddhists, perhaps. And here he's talking about Eastern Asians or Chinese people, and applauding them for being moral, ethical people and for being vegetarians. So that's one of the things I love about the Clementine literature, is that it does not criticize folks from other parts of the world or judge them. And matter of fact, it says, you know what, they're better off than we are, because they don't sacrifice animals and eat meat, and they live moral, ethical lives, unlike us. Now we're going to the homilies. "If he is fond of fat, and sacrifices and offerings and drink offerings, who then is without need, and who is wholly pure and perfect?" Okay, so, no sacrifices. Also, no alcohol. All these groups were teetotalers, of course. They did not drink alcohol. "But that he is not pleased with sacrifices," okay, "is shown by this, that those who lusted after flesh were slain as soon as they tasted it. He then, who at the first was displeased with the slaughtering of animals, not wishing them to be slain, did not ordain sacrifices as desiring them, nor from the beginning did he require them. Again, God never required sacrifices. This was a corrupt pagan demonic practice that had infiltrated Judaism and the temple cult because they got rich from it. They gained power from it. They could control and manipulate the population and all of that. For neither are sacrifices accomplished without slaughter of animals, nor can the first fruits be presented. Since then, while the heaven and the earth still stand, sacrifices have passed away. Okay, that's Jesus saying that, according to this text. And to those who suppose that God is pleased with sacrifices, he said, God wishes mercy and not sacrifices, the knowledge of himself and not holocausts. So, in other words, God wants us to know him, he wants us to follow him, and he doesn't require the blood of animals, certainly did not require the blood of his own son for the remission of sins, because baptism had already replaced it at that time, y'all. Come on. Let's get with it. Now I've been told that after he had sacrificed an ox, he feasted you in the middle of the forum, and that you, being carried away with much wine, again, don't drink alcohol, please, made friends with not only the evil demons, but their prince also, and that in this way the most of you were seized by these sicknesses, unwittingly drawing upon yourselves with your own hands a sword of destruction. So there's a karmic repercussion. You reap what you sow. So if you're killing animals, slaughtering animals, eating meat, you're going to reap what you sow. There's a karmic impact or a karmic consequence for your actions. As then, when you partook of meat offered to idols, you became servants to the prince of evil. In like manner, if you cease from these things and flee for refuge to God through the good prince of his right hand, honoring him without sacrifices by doing whatsoever he wills, know of a truth that not only will your bodies be healed, but your souls also will become healthy. For he only destroying with his left hand can quicken with his right. He only can both smite and raise the fallen. And these things which are well pleasing to God are these: to pray to him, to ask from him, recognizing that he is the giver of all things and gives with discriminating law, to abstain from the table of devils, not to taste dead flesh. Don't eat meat. They were pretty extreme. They said don't even eat at the same table with people that are eating meat. They believed that you could become possessed by demons if you ate with people that were eating meat. I don't take it that far. It certainly hasn't been my experience, but pretty clear here. Don't taste dead flesh. Don't eat meat. Not to touch blood, to be washed from all pollution, and the rest in one word. As the God-fearing Jews have heard, do you also hear, and be of one mind in many bodies. Let each man be minded to do to his neighbor those good things he wishes for himself, the golden rule. Okay? We all should be following that. The world would be a much better place, a much more peaceful place. And this is the service he has appointed, to worship him only and trust only in the prophet of truth. So, there's one God, there's one prophet, and to be baptized for the remission of sins. Again, and thus by this pure baptism to be born again unto God by saving water, the living waters. To abstain from the table of devils, that is, from food offered to idols, from dead carcasses, don't eat meat, from animals which have been suffocated or caught by wild beasts, from blood. Okay, let's see. However, such choice has occurred to you, perhaps without you understanding or knowing my manner of life, that I use only bread and olives and rarely potterbs. This is a similar verse from the homilies that we found in the recognitions, that this is my only coat and cloak that I wear, and I have no need of any of them. Okay, so again, we find these ideas of voluntary simple living or voluntary poverty. The Ebionites means the poor ones. This is a key tenet of the Essenes, Yeshua, his disciples, the Ebionites. So people nowadays that are millionaires, billionaires living with a lot of excess and a very selfish, materialistic, greedy lifestyle that call themselves Christians. I try not to judge anyone, but you know, get with it. These things seem good to the all-seeing God that you lord it over no man, that you trouble no one, unless anyone of his own accord subject himself to you, worshiping you and sacrificing and pouring libations. Again, don't eat meat, don't drink alcohol, and partaking of your table or accomplishing aught else that they ought not, or shedding blood, or tasting dead flesh. Again, sacrificing and eating meat were synonymous. They went hand in hand. Or filling themselves with that which is torn of beasts, or that which is cut, or that which is strangled, or aught else that is unclean. Don't eat meat. They assigned them feasts from sacrifices, libations, flutes, and shoutings, by means of which senseless men, being deceived, and their kingdom being taken from them, yet did not desist from the worship that they had taken up with. So, don't have wild parties, uh, you know, big barbecues where you're cooking meat, serving meat, getting drunk. Uh, they also howl after their sacrificial soirée, their soul from the depth, as it were by dreams, forewarning them of the punishment that is to befall such deeds of theirs. Again, karma, it's real. You reap what you sow. If you're killing animals, eating animals, you got some consequences coming your way, folks. Therefore, in the belief that he was ignorant, and rejoiced in murder, and let off the wicked in consequence of the gifts of sacrifices. So that's that. Don't eat meat. Vegetarian diet. Don't drink alcohol. Live a simple lifestyle. Voluntary, simple living. Pacifism. Communalism. These were all mysticism. These were all foundational principles within the early Christian church. So please subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so, and share this video with like-minded folks, or maybe people that are leaning in the direction of vegetarian diet. You don't have to do it overnight, just take baby steps and move in that direction. You'll feel much better, you'll feel closer to God, and you'll have a much smaller karmic impact uh, on the animal kingdom and on the planet as a whole. Lots of love, many blessings.